Okay, perfect. Well, thanks very much, everyone. This is the first event of term for CLIO. And also we're joined with the Brooks Society, which is part of Caius College. It's a great honor to welcome Philip Collins to the virtual stage. It was going to be in the in-person stage, but obviously I think September, government incompetence, whatever you want to call it, has meant that we can't do it in person. But no, exactly, on the modern history of the Labour Party, its current leadership under Keir Starmer. And I'm sure it should be a very interesting talk. Philip's enjoyed a rich and varied career, working in financial services originally, before entering the political sphere. Before being appointed as Chief Speechwriter to Tony Blair, he worked as an advisor to Frank Field and headed up the think tank, the Social Market Foundation. He's since worked as a columnist for The Times and is the author of When They Go Low, We Go High, on the history of oratory and great speeches, and Start Again, How We Can Fix Our Broken Politics. He's currently a columnist for the New Statesman as of, I think, September, very recently. Brilliant. So I must add the proviso before we start. If you're expecting an interview with the drummer for Genesis, unfortunately, you might be disappointed, but nonetheless, I'm sure we'll have a fantastic talk. Brilliant. So Philip, the virtual floor is yours.
Sebastian, thank you very much. Thank you to you all for being there. I'm becoming a bit of a veteran of these remote events, which are all still slightly peculiar. You don't get any interaction with an audience, and it changes the nature of things. But they will work well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk for 25 minutes, 30 minutes. And I'm going to give you an account and an introduction to where the Labour Party finds itself and what the prospects for Keir Starmer might be, and some speculation about what he might do and how he might seek a victory for the Labour Party. And then Sebastian is going to ask me a few questions, and then I think we're going to throw it open to you. So let me start by way of introduction. Let me just try and set the current Labour leadership in the relevant context. And the context, I think, is this. Let's go right back to the beginnings of the Labour Party. Let's go back to its very origins and the 1918 Constitution, which is still the founding document of the Labour Party. And the fourth clause of that document has become very famous. It's the clause which committed the Labour Party in 1918, in the very resonant phrases of Sidney Webb, to nationalise the commanding heights of the economy, to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the fruits of their production. That became a source of real contention. Hugh Gaitskell tried to rewrite that clause in the 1950s and failed. And then Tony Blair tried again to rewrite the clause and succeeded in 1994. And it was replaced with a fairly bloodless set of remarks about the many, not the few, and a compassionate society. And the reason that was such an important and symbolic fight in the Labour Party was that both Gaitskell and Blair considered that the Labour Party's commitment to nationalisation in particular had been a significant part of why it had failed to attract the attention and the appeal of enough people to win elections. That takes me to the first clause of the Labour Party constitution, because it is in the very first clause of the Labour Party that the institution of the Labour Party is committed to securing the representatives of working people in Parliament. It is expressly the political wing of the trade union movement with a view to winning power through Parliament. And this is a very important commitment back in the day, because other European left of centre or socialist parties didn't make such a commitment. They ran their politics outside parliamentary circles as well as within. And as a consequence, you had a much stronger communist tradition in most European nations. But the Labour Party, because it comes out, as Ernest Bevin said, out of the bowels of the trade union movement, is from the beginning a very pragmatic institution. And in the early years of the Labour Party, you saw this battle played out between the trade unionists on the one side, who were first clause pragmatists, and then the middle class intellectuals of the Labour Party, who were for the most part fourth clause doctrinal purists. And it's a battle that has never gone away. It is the battle of the Labour Party. This makes the Labour Party quite distinct from the Conservative Party, which although it's at any given moment always has things it wants to do, it's not without ideology and it's not without policy, it doesn't have a consistent thread. and it doesn't claim to have. The Conservative Party is an intrinsically pragmatic party whose beliefs are, it wears its beliefs fairly light, and it sees no shame or has no compunction in veering from George Osborne's austerity only a few years ago to the turn the taps on spending that we're seeing at the moment. And within the Conservative Party, there's no great agonizing over that. It just is a perfectly, they would say, a perfectly reasonable response to the circumstances which are laid before them. Now, that kind of pragmatism is looked on askance within the Labour Party, which has a real sense of itself as a party which is a custodian of certain values and disciplines and desires and objectives. And the reason this is crucial is that somewhere in this fight, in this conflict, lies the reason why the Labour Party is such an unsuccessful electoral machine. Bear in mind, it is devised as an electoral body, as the mechanism for engendering independent representation of working people in Parliament. And in all the time since then, from the full formation of the Labour Party in 1906 through to the present day, 114 years later, really there have only been 3 serious electoral victories of the Labour Party. There were 2 small victories in the 1920s to get the party going, minority governments, but only on 3 occasions, or rather only of 3 leaders, has the Labour Party won an overall majority in Parliament and succeeded where its founders set out. And those 3 occasions were 1945, very exceptional circumstances after the Second World War, then 1966, 64, a small victory, 66, a large one with Harold Wilson, and then the 3 victories that Tony Blair won, 97, 2001, and 2005. And that's not much to show for a century of endeavour. You know, to put that in context, the Conservative Party has managed to find 3 leaders who've won an overall majority in general elections since 2015. David Cameron, Theresa May, and Boris Johnson have all managed to win victories. Theresa May, a minority victory, but a victory nonetheless. And the Labour Party has really struggled to win elections. It's a very unsuccessful political enterprise by its own lights. Now, and here we get straight back to this conflict, because the minute you start to talk in these terms within the Labour Party, you get accused of wanting to win at all costs. You get accused of wanting to win as though that were your only objective and you have nothing that you want to win for. And this is a constant fight in the Labour Party. And Labour have just had a leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who I think tested to destruction the idea that a pure doctrinal Labour Party could also be a pragmatically successful one. Because Corbyn's tenure as leader of the Labour Party was the first time since the 1980s that the Labour left had taken control of the party. And the Labour left took control of the Labour Party this time in really quite hospitable circumstances. In that politics has been severely upset. The Conservative Party had gone through the turmoils of austerity, which were causing real pain and anguish, and political capital could be made of it. We then went through a Brexit tumult, and politics is really thrown up in the air. And into this comes the Labour Party's left and the Corbyn leadership. And it appeared in the 2017 election, when Corbyn ran against Theresa May, that against all expectations and against all precedent in British politics, perhaps it was possible to win a victory from the left. So this enthusiasm began to bubble up in the Labour Party, that something which had been denied them since 1945, which was when the Labour Party really is as it wishes to be, that seemed to be compatible with the prospect of victory for a brief moment. In 2017, the Corbyn Labour Party came much closer to victory than most people anticipated they could. And that led to a sort of enthusiasm and a wellspring thinking, well, it can happen next time. Of course, what then happens in 2019 is that those high expectations are very severely disappointed. And the Labour Party in 2019, against Boris Johnson's Conservatives, delivered its worst electoral result since 1935. It was a really, really terrible result, an 80-seat overall majority for the Conservative Party, with also no prospect of a recovery in Scotland, which has for a long time been a real redoubt of the Labour Party, has left in a very, very tough place. Such that if Labour wants to win an overall majority from here, and it isn't capable of winning back seats in Scotland, then Labour needs to win, for example, in Somerset, where Jacob Rees-Mogg is a Member of Parliament. That's the kind of seat Labour needs to take. And the Labour Party, as it currently stands, is a very long way from being the sort of body that can appeal to a seat like that. So the recovery road is a very long one, and Jeremy Corbyn has left his successor in a very, very difficult place. And there are lots of reasons for the defeat in 2019. And Keir Starmer has taken his time as leader to contemplate what they might be. There are two schools of thought. The first school of thought is that the leader was terrible and that you cannot possibly win a general election in Britain if your leader ranks 20, 25 points behind the leader of your rival party. The second school of thought says, no, it wasn't the leader's fault. It was all to do with the Labour Party's position on Brexit. That to go into the election with a strong Remain message did nothing to retain the traditional Labour seats in the West Midlands and the north of England, which subsequently went over to the Conservatives on the grounds that they wanted to get Brexit done. And it's a very good rule of thumb in the analysis of politics. Whenever you're confronted with a dispute like this between two rival schools of thought, to just try on yourself the idea that both of them might be right. And this is certainly true here. I think both of these things are obviously true. And the discussion is, to what extent are they true, not whether or not they're true. It is absolutely the case that Boris Johnson had a character and a verve and an elan and a sense of leadership that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't able to match. I think it's also true the British people had not seen much of Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. By 2019, they'd taken a longer look, and by and large, they hadn't liked what they'd seen. His ratings going into the election were catastrophically low, lower than any leader of the opposition in recent memory, and really there was no prospect of recovery from a position as low as that. I think, secondly, too, it is true, though, nevertheless, that the Labour Party's position on Brexit was problematic. It neither nailed itself absolutely fundamentally as the party of Remain, but nor did it give anything really to its erstwhile supporters who might have voted to leave the European Union. The Labour Party itself is a deeply Remain party in all its membership, and it seemed as though they were telling the electorate, well, I know you voted to leave in a referendum, but you're just going to have to do that again. They weren't explicitly saying that, and so you added to the fact of seeming to disrespect the electoral mandate of the mandate of the referendum, with also a sense of indecision. And it was a really unwelcome cocktail, and it was politically a terrible and unclear position. It would have been better to be clear on the other side than it was to try and have it both ways, because then you get the disbenefit of both. So Labour did have a really poor electoral offer with a leader who was not trusted. And the other crucial thing is that when asked who you trusted to run the economy better, Labour came in 25 points below the Conservatives. And the reason these things are crucial is not just about 2019. Obviously, Brexit is a specific political event, but subtract Brexit from that analysis and look at the leadership trailing and look at the trailing on the economy. And that has been true. Those two things have been true every time Labour has lost a general election. And so that brings you to the analysis of where Keir Starmer is, which is he starts in a really terrible position. By the time the Labour Party's endless processes had gone through and Starmer was actually made the leader, the Labour position had faltered even further. And they were 20 odd points behind in the opinion polls. The government, in just the pre-COVID days, if anybody can remember such a thing, was riding incredibly high, well over 50% of the opinion polls, and Labour were absolutely in a trough. And this is the moment that Starmer becomes leader of the Labour Party. So to that extent, he's already done extremely well, because the Labour Party and the Tories are roughly neck and neck in the opinion polls now. Starmer himself ranks considerably higher than Boris Johnson as who would make a good Prime Minister. And these are very encouraging signs for the Labour Party. And let's just look at the two dimensions. The first one being leadership. I think for the first time in living memory, the Labour Party has a leader who looks as though he could be Prime Minister, who looks as though he might be a viable prospect to lead the country. You look at his online conference speech that he did recently, a very peculiar occasion, but nevertheless still interesting for the sorts of lines he was starting to offer to the country. And to have a lead of the Labour Party who is able to say to the Prime Minister that when you were writing flippant articles in the Daily Telegraph about bendy bananas, I was a lawyer in court prosecuting terrorists and sending them to prison. That's quite a good line. It's not something you can imagine Jeremy Corbyn ever saying. To have a leader of the Labour Party who could say that I came from suburban Surrey, I made my way in the world, I became Director of Public Prosecutions, I won a knighthood through my own endeavour, and then I took my mum, who was really proud of me, to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. Now that is a story that actually has great political resonance. And again, it's a very un-Labour-like story. So Starmer's got certain characteristics which make him a really serious proposition, just as a person. And a lot of political leadership and the politics generally is much quicker than we think. Judgments are made very, very fast on people. And that kind of leadership quality gets you permission to be heard. And Starmer just has it. It's something that you have or you don't. And he does have that. So it doesn't get you very far, but it gets you in through the door. And so that's the first thing on leadership. The second thing is more substantively then, what will he do? What kind of Labour Party does Keir Starmer want to lead? There's a couple of things here. Firstly, they correspond back to the first and the fourth clause of the Labour Party constitution. On the fourth clause point, what does he want to do? Where does he come from intellectually? I'm not entirely certain he knows quite. And Starmer has not spent his 30s in politics like most people in politics have. He spent his 30s in the law. He's quite new to politics. He's not especially formed intellectually. I think he comes from the soft left of the Labour Party. I don't think he's a million miles away from the position that Ed Miliband occupied when he was leader of the Labour Party. I think he's a very strong, liberal, Remain lawyer. I'm not sure where that leaves him with respect to his economic position, for example. Labour Party is still quite empty of policy. It's not clear where they're going. And that brings me to the second point, the first clause point, which is that one thing which is abundantly clear about Starmer already is that he's very, very serious. And what I mean by that is that he really does want to win. His conference speech was notable because he kept saying that. He said over and over again that I'm tired of losing. He went through the Labour winners and he analysed in that speech why they won and why they lost. And what he was saying to the Labour Party was, whatever it is that those people did in order to win, well, we've got to do that. And I think that was softening the Labour Party up for things it may not like. So I rather suspect there's going to be a fight within the soul of the leader between the things he'd like to be, the slightly soft left lawyer he'd like to be, and in a sense is, with the set of things that he might have to do in order to win. And I think he is sufficiently serious about the objective of winning that he'll probably try and drag his party back over to the political centre. And his party, it remains to be seen whether his party does so willingly or reluctantly. By the end of the 18 years of Conservative government between 1979 and 1997, the Labour Party had got to a point where it was just so hungry to win that it was prepared to go with Tony Blair, even though he didn't look like one of them. Roy Jenkins famously said about Tony Blair, he climbed up the building from the outside. He wasn't an inside the Labour Party person. But the Labour Party wanted to win so much by then that it was happy to do that. Whether the Labour Party has got to that point yet under Keir Starmer, I'm not sure. We shall see. But that's going to be the task for him. That's where he's got to try and take it. And that's the thing that stands before him now, is what does he do? What might that mean in policy terms? On the economy, it's going to be very difficult because the the centre of gravity of economic policy is shifting all the time. The pandemic changes everything, of course, and the spending, which will be the result of trying to recover from the pandemic, poses a problem for a Labour Party. The general lines of political engagement are the Conservatives are the fiscally solid party, and the Labour Party tend to want to open up and spend more. Well, those aren't the terms at the moment. I don't think the Labour Party can outflank the Tories on saying we should spend even more. So you saw the early signs of a very peculiar political flip in the two conference seasons. So Annalise Dodds, who's the Shadow Chancellor, actually started criticising Rishi Sunak, former Goldman Sachs banker, for being profligate. She was actually making a fiscally conservative critique of the Conservative Party. So politics is all over the place at the moment, and quite where that rests is very hard to tell. I think Starmer will have to develop some lines too on crime and antisocial behaviour, which are, again, not the natural habitat of the Labour Party. And here Tony Blair is a very interesting template, because one of the reasons Blair won so emphatically in working class England was because he was, to put a not too fine a point on it, really right wing on crime. He was really hardcore on crime and antisocial behaviour. And that wasn't an electoral tactic or a posture. That's what he thought. He just really was. And he took the view that the victims of crime are predominantly the poorest people in the country, and that therefore there's nothing left wing about being soft on crime. On the contrary, he thought it ought to be left of centre position, to be very tough on crime. And accordingly, he was. Now, that's not where the Labour Party's instincts are. To be frank, it's not where my instincts are. But that is where the electoral benefit derives, particularly in the places that Labour needs to win back in order to secure an overall majority. So there's an uncomfortable set of conversations Starmer has to have too. You've then got the questions of the running of the state, of the health service, of education, and of welfare. The Labour Party has not done serious policy thinking on any of these things for a long time now. The latter Blair years had a certain direction in public service reform, which was then picked up by the Conservative Party. So Michael Gove, as Education Secretary, essentially follows the template laid down by his Labour predecessors. The same is true in the even the old Blair advisor then becomes the chief executive of National Health Service England. So you got continuity of policy for quite a long time with the Blair and Cameron years. That's changing now as Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have their own set of directions, and the Labour Party remains really a policy-free zone. This is for the moment deliberate. It's generally thought it's not wise to develop detailed policy too early in a parliament. That's for two reasons. One is that things will change, and anything that you commit to in 2019 is likely to look pretty out of date or irrelevant by 2024. But secondly, also, if you do come up with anything interesting, then the government can simply steal it and do it, and you're left with nothing. So it's generally, you tend to develop your policy slowly, and the trick of being leader of the opposition is that you give enough of a flavour of where you're going so that people think you've got something to say without committing yourself. It's a difficult balancing act, but that's the job of opposition. That's why they don't come up with policy very early on. They're often criticised for not having something concrete to say, but it is a deliberate strategy, and Starmer will definitely follow that. So I think policy will be late in the day, but it's worth watching for where they're heading with that. What kind of policies are they heading towards? Because at the moment, they're fairly good on the critique of the government, but they're very light on anything which is suggestive of where they might go to. And in the end, this brings me right back to the start, the Labour Party is not satisfied with a victory which doesn't seem to have a purpose at its heart. It will be incumbent on Starmer, if he's going to bring the party with him, to be able to define an idea of what a Labour Britain is for. He needs a sense of purpose, he needs a sense of drive, and he'll have to start developing that over time. If he can do that in a way which excites the Labour Party, and I should say, it's not just about tactics. That a sense of excitement is part of politics, and if you get people excited about where you might go, that's an important political skill. It's vital. There has to be a certain poetry in politics as well, which is often lost. If he can do that, and it's a very big effort, it's not his strength. If he can, then I think he will secure permission from the party to do some of the other things he may have to do in order to secure a very, very difficult victory. So he's got one hell of a task on his hands. 80 seats behind, it's a very long way. The swing required for the Labour Party to come back to power from the position it finds itself in is pretty much exactly the swing that Tony Blair won in 1997. And here's where I'll end, with one potential similarity between the two times. 1997, in a sense, was an inevitable victory because you had a long period of Conservative government was coming to an end. There was a fatigue had set in after such a long time. There's a natural swing away. But also, 1992, Black Wednesday had really eliminated the government's reputation for economic competence. It is possible, though not certain, but it's entirely possible that the government's handling of the pandemic will slowly start to solidify as a serious weakness of, and a characteristic weakness of this government. It will begin to look as though that's what Boris Johnson is really like. Someone who's a good campaigner, a really good talker, but not suited to the slow grind of administration. And that if and when the economic effects of the pandemic, principally unemployment, really feed through, and we have unemployment in double digits and 4 million people are looking for work, at that point, the punishment which is inflicted on the government could be quite severe. And there's a great deal of luck involved in all of this. You know, I don't blame the government for the pandemic. I'm sympathetic even to their handling of it because I appreciate how difficult it is. And the economic consequences correspondingly are not their fault. And indeed, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has, I think, responded well. He's been the most impressive member of the government. But nevertheless, politics isn't fair. And there will be a punishment that comes from people living in really tough circumstances. And just at this moment, the Conservative Party has won a victory in seats that they're not accustomed to winning, with a new electorate, a new bunch of former Labour voters who, as Boris Johnson put it, have lent their votes to the Conservative Party. Now, if those people are suffering unemployment in serious numbers, that becomes an incredibly difficult election for the Tories to win convincingly. It is also, for the arithmetical reasons I gave you, a very difficult election for the Labour Party to win. And so we could be heading back towards territory where it's hard for anyone to break out. But one thing I'm certain of, that Keir Starmer, though he doesn't quite know where he's heading yet, is clause 4 is still to be sketched in. I absolutely think, from talking to him and from watching him and from listening to him, that his first clause objective is clear. He's absolutely serious about winning. He said explicitly in his recent speech, he wants to be the 4th Labour winner. And the big question of the next few years of politics is, what does the Labour Party need to do to win, and can Starmer do it? There we go. Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Philip, for that view on Starmer. And actually, I want to pick up on that a little bit, because Starmer's been one, particularly in PMQs, to emphasise to Johnson. I think Johnson flaying a little bit, but Starmer's emphasising that the Labour Party's under new management, right? So you can't criticise me for my predecessor's haplessness, particularly over issues relating to his connivance with former terrorists, particularly the IRA question, but also, I think, most importantly, the anti-Semitism question. And I think this is an important one, because the Labour Party came under fire massively for what they describe as institutional anti-Semitism. And the thing with institutional is that it doesn't necessarily just go away overnight with a new leader. It reflects perhaps something that underlying in the party, the membership. So what does Keir Starmer need to do to win back the confidence of British Jews who had voted for Labour in the past back to the party? What does he need to do that?
I think he needs to root out all the people who are still in there, and I think he's doing it. I think he will. I think the report of the EHRC into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which is due quite soon, will be quite a big moment. And the response that Starmer offers to that will be indicative of whether or not he's deeply serious about this question. I think he is. I think he'll respond in a very serious way. I think any Labour spokesperson from any part of the party says anything untoward about that report, I think that will be a pretext for them being expelled. So I think there could be quite a big moment. I think someone will respond very vigorously to that. I think in parallel with that, there's an internal effort to root out any remaining anti-Semites from the Labour Party and kick them out. For the most part, and I'm a bit sceptical of the idea of institutional anything, in fact, because I don't really believe in forests unless they're full of trees. And the Labour Party is full of people. And for the most part, the Labour Party is not an anti-Semitic party. And it was only became open to so many anti-Semites who did flood in because they thought, and in my view correctly, that the leadership was turning a bit of a blind eye to it. And that's, I think the Labour Party leadership was so anti-American and so anti-imperialist and so anti-capitalist. They get all these things wrapped up, and the place where that gets mostly wrapped up is Israel and Palestine. And that is an issue of overriding importance to the left in politics. And therefore, though they themselves are anti-Semites, they are often fellow travelers with people who are. And their hostility to America, their hostility to what they think of as power politics, means that people like Jeremy Corbyn always position themselves on the side of the people they think are the oppressed, even when the oppressed, as with the IRA, for example, are themselves people of violence. So they always think there's a greater good. And that is their general presumption in politics, and therefore they attracted into the Labour Party people who have no place within it. And the test for Starmer will be, can he eradicate them, and does he respond fiercely to the report? I was really gratified by the fact the very first thing Starmer said when he became leader of the Labour Party was an apology to British Jewry for the appalling behaviour of the party. I mean, I was someone who left the Labour Party because I couldn't stomach being a member of a party that I regarded as essentially anti-Semitic. And so I was delighted that he took it that seriously, to respond so quickly. I was also delighted when Rebecca Long-Bailey shared something from Maxine Peake had circulated, which contained anti-Semitic material. I mean, Maxine Peake subsequently apologized. She hadn't realized, and she was very sorry. And Rebecca Long-Bailey refused to apologize, and Starmer sacked her. And again, I thought that was good. It was emphatic and decisive. So I agree it's a very serious precondition of being a serious party. But what a low bar it is that we should be commending the Labour leader for not being racist, and an extraordinary low bar. But I think so far he's been very good on that. And I know some of the funding the Labour Party used to get is starting to come back. And there is a confidence that Starmer is serious about this. But in the end, he has to expel an act. But I do believe he will.
No, exactly. And I want to touch on this idea of particularly as you're saying, there's going to be a bit of a fight in the Labour Party. Not so much in the Labour Party between Keir Starmer, he wants to win. He wants to win, but there's going to be a little bit of a pushback from that wing that's still very much present. I think one of the things we've seen very recently was Len McCluskey and the Unite's decision to cut funding by 10%. Now, Starmer is that's probably a good thing because it means I'm no longer associated with that party. But I think also maybe it suggests, and I think this was something that this exasperation with maybe the Labour Party moving back to the centre, that in December 2019, in that pre-period before the election, that actually centrism was under massive threat, right? You had people like Rory Stewart, David Gauke, centrists in Parliament being ejected from the Tory party, and they were completely rejected at the election, right? So David Gauke ran on an independent ticket. He lost to the Conservative. Dominic Grieve, similar, and obviously Rory Stewart ended up running for mayor. Is centrism a spent political force, or do you believe that actually coronavirus, which, as you say, has flipped the political script, will allow centrism a kind of a new birth?
Well, firstly, I think that, those people you mentioned, of course, they stood under new political dispensation, the new parties or independents, and there's really, the British political system allows no space for people who are independent. So that would have been, no matter what their politics would have been, they would have disappeared under the current system. So I don't think they are evidence of it. I think what's happened is the two parties had shifted somewhat to their respective wings. So the people in the centre were pushed out of the two political parties. I don't think that reflects an enormous change in the country, but it is the aftermath of a Brexit referendum, which really changed everything. But it created new alignments in politics and new camps, and it also changed the two political parties, and it provided a dominating issue so that all the other things on which we may or may not be left wing, right wing, or centrist ceased to really matter, as everything became simply reflected through the prism of Brexit. And politics has changed very significantly at the moment in this sense, is that if you look back at 1951, and if I were to know your occupational status and your income status, I would be able to predict with almost complete accuracy how you voted. Politics was class aligned and it was income aligned. That relationship began to break down slowly from 51, but still into the 90s and 2000s, it was pretty strong. 2019, that information, your occupation and your income, was of no value to me at all in predicting how you voted. It ceased to matter in the slightest. Whereas if I'd been able to ask you a series of cultural questions, such as what do you think, generally speaking, about feminism, globalization, immigration, multicultural society, climate change, a whole series of questions like that. If you'd answered on the sort of cosmopolitan liberal side to all of those questions, I would be able to predict with almost complete accuracy that you were a Remain voter and that you voted Labour, Liberal Democrat, or Green. Correspondingly, if you'd said something illiberal and not cosmopolitan to all of those questions, I knew you were a UKIP voter, I knew you were a Conservative voter. Now, there's lots of people who answer yes to some and no to others, and they're in the middle, and they're distributed between the parties. But the most important correspondence, the Labour Party's got to map itself onto that. And so the question of left, right, centre becomes not really the organising principle of politics all of a sudden. So I don't really think that the people who were in the centre have got nothing to say anymore. And indeed, the whole analysis that Starmer's offering is in the old currency, I suppose, to move back to the centre somewhat, because it's still, once Brexit has gone, and here's the really fascinating thing now, is Boris Johnson has won his victory based on Brexit. What is it that holds together people who live in Hampshire, in leafy lanes, and people who live in Middlesbrough? Nothing apart from Brexit. I mean, really nothing but Brexit. And the most terrible thing that Boris Johnson has done is that he's gone and got Brexit done. Don't do that, because now you don't have the issue. What you want really in politics, ideally, is to almost succeed. Like Nicola Sturgeon's genius is to almost get independence, because then that allows her to carry on with the grievance that she wants independence, which gives her political life, but also looks successful because she's almost got it. Whereas what Boris Johnson's done is he's gone and achieved it. And for those people who like it, that's a big political accomplishment. But he doesn't have the issue anymore. So he's going to have to find arguments to keep this coalition together, which is why we keep having these attempts at various cultural war questions, because you've got to keep life in that coalition. So I wonder whether the politics of culture are going to survive a recession. That's going to be very interesting. That if you have a really tough material time across the country, but very particularly in those areas that Troyes have just won, and Brexit's been done, will those questions really be paramount? I suspect not. So I think there'll be a premium once again on a good, solid leader with an economic policy that looks credible. Now, if that's the definition of centrism, then I think centrism will be alive and well, and I think that the party that most embodies it will win. And you could say, finally, in any case, that the party which has been the closest to the political centre has won every election since Tony Blair. You know, I don't regard Boris Johnson as a swivel-eyed right-winger. I really don't. I mean, on the contrary, look at what some of his Let's look at the things he borrows from the left in the sense of use of the state. I think he's a funny mixture of things. I wouldn't describe him, though, as right wing. I wouldn't say that's true at all. I think conservative economic policy is changing a lot. But I think you could argue that, in fact, the centrist parties in power, but probably that wasn't the victory they won. That wasn't the spectrum on which it's best analysed.
No, I think it's going to be interesting, as you say, to see exactly how the language flips, right? Because of course, Rishi's borrowing. There's going to be a need to raise money. Could that be in higher taxes? Could it be a wealth tax? Could that shift some Tory loyalists? I mean, there's a huge uproar in the Tory party with this kind of new state power, and also with the fact that Rishi his munificence bankrupt us all. And in which case, if taxes go up, might that lead voters in slightly middle class voters to consider Starmer for the first time? But that topsy-turvy. Well, I'd like, before I open up, just to touch on go back to the Corbyn project very quickly, because of course some Corbynists would say, actually, if you look at 2017, the June 2017 election, we did quite well, right? We saw a 30-seat gain. We increased the numbers quite well. But ultimately we didn't win. But Theresa May had to negotiate a deal. Is it the case that Corbyn, the candidate May, was so bad that it meant that Corbyn was going to do better, or was it the case that actually there was some underlying popularity with Corbyn's vision that couldn't be carried through into 2019?
I think in retrospect, 2017 was a very poor performance by the Labour Party. The reason it's gone down as a good performance is that expectations were so low. It was assumed that Corbyn would be wiped away, not least by Theresa May. And that then, when it proved to be not so easy to simply swat aside the Labour Party, the analysis became current that somehow the Labour Party had done incredibly well. And I don't really think in retrospect that's true. The only general election in British electoral history in which the incumbent government has won whilst living standards were declining was 2017. If you look at the political science data around the election, everything was telling you that this was an election the Labour Party ought to have won, and yet they didn't win. So I think in retrospect, and this is the wisdom of retrospect, I didn't think this at the time, but looking back on it, you think actually that was not the performance Labour Party should have put in at that time. And yet, I suppose if Labour had been better, if Labour had been close to the Tories or indeed in front, there wouldn't have been a general election anyway. So the only reason we got this test is precisely because people thought Corbyn was so bad. So yes, Corbyn outperformed, low expectations, both as a performer on the stage, he did, and as a politician, he did. And I think the question of whether there was some underlying attraction to the programme is a very important one for the Labour Party now, because there's still a strong argument within the Labour Party that the programme was attractive. It was just the message was great, but the messenger wasn't right. And that's a very tempting illusion, I think, for the Labour Party. I don't think it's true. I think that, firstly, most people don't pay that much attention to politics. They don't really disentangle the message and the messenger. The messenger is the symbol and the embodiment of the message. They don't really know the details of nationalisation of water, which I'm all in favour of, but I don't trust Jeremy Corbyn. So I'm not sure you can quite disentangle them. But most people didn't know a great deal about Labour's policies, and there's quite a strong sense that Labour weren't going to win. Therefore, it didn't need to be interrogated all that closely. I think the prospect of Labour being one of the main reasons why Labour lost in 2019 was it did quite well in 2017. So it raised the prospect that Labour was a serious contender for power, which no one had really thought in 2017. And at that point, people take a closer look and people think, well, actually, no, I didn't mean that. Because 2017 was a sort of hit at the government. The other thing in 2017, which makes it an exceptional election, I think, was that Brexit was still in play. It wasn't about doing Brexit. It was a replay of the referendum, because the two tribes gathered again, and the one tribe, which was really angry and sore about the referendum, decided to hit and punish the government. Now, where could you go to punish the government? they all decided to gather around the Labour Party. And also, Jeremy Corbyn did one act of strategic brilliance, which is that nobody had the first idea what he thought about Europe. Just no idea what he thought. And that was, in fact, brilliant, because everyone who wanted to hit the government, who was a Remainer, essentially voted Labour. But quite a lot of the people who were Labour supporting Brexit supporters stuck with the Labour Party because they assumed, probably rightly, that Jeremy Corbyn was on their side. So he managed to have it both ways on the Brexit question for that election, which was a very clever. And I think he convinced himself that he could do that again. But 2 years later, with Brexit having gone on and a deal having gone through the House and the election explicitly defined as the Brexit election, he wasn't able to do it. So I think the circumstances of 2017, looking back on them, were unique, and everything came together for the Labour Party to do as well as it could possibly do, but it probably should have done better. So I don't take the message that the country is hankering for a left-wing programme. It's yet another example, I think, of a country which is apparently hankering for left-wing politics, and yet which inexplicably seems to give an 80-seat majority to the Conservative Party. It always happens like this when the left are in charge of the Labour Party. So I think that would be a mistake. And I think COVID allows Starmer to wipe the slate clean. I think to some extent, genuinely too, the effect of a pandemic means that quite a lot of the questions we were talking about in 2017 really were a very long time ago. And they weren't necessarily the things that will be the first port of call after the pandemic. So I think it gives you the opportunity to say, well, let's start again, really. Let's think now, apply the values we have to the current situation, and let's devise a new program which is relevant to 2024, which is going to seem like a long time away from 2017.
Exactly, long time to digest, exactly as you say, with the handling of the coronavirus, pandemic, and it'll be interesting to see whether people like Annalise Dodds can actually, and it's been criticised for not ruffling Rishi enough, but it'll be interesting to see when time goes out how that plays out. I'm conscious of time. I'd like to go to, I think it's John and Joshua, the secretaries of the Brook, and who have a question. I'm going to unmute John first. Can I unmute? Are you unmuted, John?
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Okay, brilliant. John,
can you hear me?
Ask.
Super. Yeah, thanks, Seb. Phil, I'd like to ask a couple of broader questions and shift the focus a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And firstly, just about the fact that you've worked both closely with politicians and in the press, and just a broad question about what sorts of insights working closely with politicians gave you into the world of the political press and vice versa.
Right. Well, is there another question, or do you want me to take that?
Josh, do you want to put one forward?
Okay. Let me take this one. Then I'll come to this one. I think it's very interesting looking at the press from the vantage point of politics, and then vice versa, because the two worlds don't really understand each other very well. And quite often, me and my ex-colleague Danny Finkelstein would sit there in a meeting in the Times, and they'd be talking about politics. The journalists would be talking about politics. And we'd look at each other and we'd exchange a glance which said, they don't really understand how it works. Because when you work inside somewhere, of course, you know how things happen, how things get done. And outside observers only see the public face of it, and they don't quite get it. So the press always think that within politics, somewhere, there is to be located a secret plan, a beating heart where some controlling intelligence is doing everything on purpose, and also doing so with perfect acumen and brilliance. And they're always trying to find out what's really going on. You're not telling us the truth, what's really going on. The truth is, it's usually chaotic in there, and it's a total disaster area, and no one's in control, and it's a complete mess like any workplace. By the same token, people in politics think that the press are deliberately out to get them. And when you work in a newspaper, you realize that, like everywhere else, a newspaper is a bit chaotic too. Everybody's running up against the deadline, everybody's short of time, everybody's trying to find a story which isn't in the other newspaper. You've got the competitive rivalry of all the other papers. there isn't time for a conspiracy, and and no one's in charge of it in any case. So you've got this feeling from both sides that the other side is conspiratorial against it, and neither side is right. And I think the final thing is that the relationship is really dysfunctional, because it's very difficult, for example, for politicians to admit to doubt. If you say in response to a question, well, I'm not really sure, which is usually almost always the answer, because the real, genuine, private answer to pretty much any question in politics is, well, it could be that, or it could be that. It's 51-49, but I'm going with that. And yet, if you say something like that, admit to uncertainty and doubt, it won't be written up as very sophisticated politician admits to his reasoning process. It will be written up as government not certain it's even right. Government doesn't know what it's doing. And so you affect this completely fake certainty in politics. And it's really, really damaging, because you're not certain. And when you turn out to be wrong, which 49% of the time you will be, you sound really foolish. And it all derives from the fact that the politicians don't trust the reporting process, and the reporters think the politicians are lying to them. And there's this horrible, vicious circle takes place between the two, which I think is being interrupted now by the fact that I thought for some time, a long time in fact, that the role of the press, the importance of the press in politics is hugely overrated. And I thought that before social media and politics going online, and I doubly, triply think it now, that the arena in which lots of people who grew up in politics have been schooled, which is the combat of press and politics, is just not where politics is happening for most people any longer. I think there's something very old-fashioned about the relations between the press and the politicians. I think the institution, for example, of the American institution of getting someone to do a daily on-the-record press briefing is all fine, but it seems so old politics. It seems so yesterday that I really can't get particularly excited by it. Politics is taking place somewhere else now, and I think the combatants of press and politics are very, very slow to catch up with that.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Josh. Do you want to pose a question, Josh?
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks, Phil, for a very good. I would just have one quick question vis-a-vis coronavirus, COVID-19. I was wondering, you mentioned that you were sympathetic or to the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, and I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that, and more specifically, given your history as writing speechwriter and working in journalism, what you could say about the communication of these policies, and how that's played out, how good that's been, etc.
Right, it's a very good question, because you've hit on the one part of what they've done where I'm not sympathetic. So let me tell you what I meant by being sympathetic. What I mean is that I know how difficult it is to make judgments when you've got incomplete information, when things are moving quickly, and when you're doing things which are unprecedented, and you don't know the impacts of them, and you've got competing imperatives. So it's all very well to say, follow the science. And obviously that sounds rational and right. But the scientists have one particular job, one view. Whereas as the politician, your job is to balance that requirement with other things, such as liberties, and such as the health of the economy, which has a whole series of other consequences, some of them health consequences. So the science is not a singular thing which can simply be followed. It has to be applied, and it has to be balanced. And there are no good, right and wrong answers to these things, at least not at the time of making the decision. They're really difficult. And you're in territory you've not been in before. So I'm very sympathetic to the fact that you might have tried something, it doesn't work. It doesn't mean you're an idiot. It doesn't mean you're a fool. It means you made an error. And perhaps it was a culpable error. Usually it wasn't. Usually it was an explicable error. But I think it's difficult. So I'm sympathetic in that sense. However, that doesn't mean to say the government's off a hook or the government's responded particularly well, because I don't think it has. And that you've picked up the point where you can see this most explicitly, I think, which is that the one thing you are in control of in a crisis like this is what you say about it. It is the one thing you can guarantee, because you are in control of when you say things and what you say and how you say it. And I remember the fuel crisis, and the one thing we knew, and we knew virtually nothing else, was that we had to speak plainly and clearly and consistently and regularly about what was happening. And I think the communication during the handling of this crisis has been really poor. You know, for example, Boris Johnson keeps making enormous promises, you know, the moonshot, and he thinks that's demonstrating optimism and can-do spirit. It isn't. It's just confusing people, because he makes it sound like everything's going to be fine by Christmas. And then when he subsequently has to say, oh, well, no, in fact, Manchester's got to lock down again, and maybe London will soon, then it's not just a mixed message, it's a contradiction. It's confusion. So I found the communication of it to be really peculiar and really strange. And the complete absence of consistency. Again, it's not just being consistent, because things change. And if you're clear, you can say, last week, this was the case, and we had this policy. Now, this set of things has happened, and therefore we're moving. And that's not inconsistent. That's perfectly rational and reasonable, and you can take people with you. But to constantly veer between an enormous promise and then next week forgetting about it altogether, you know, millions of tests and trace in a week, and then just never mention it again, it's really random and erratic. So I think they have been really poor at that. I think but I think Boris Johnson has been exposed as not very good by this crisis, and I think he is his virtues, they're considerable, are as a winner of power, but his real flaws are as a wielder of power. I don't think he knows what he wants, and I don't think he's got the attention span and the ability to do the day-to-day work. And I think that has been exposed. You can see that in the communications.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll throw that back to Seb now.
Okay, brilliant. So just, I don't want to keep Philip too long, but we might try and get in maybe 5 minutes worth of 10 minutes worth of questions. Is that okay, Philip? Are you?
Yeah, that's fine by me.
So if anyone in the wider audience, I'll try and work this. So if you can put your hand up on the Zoom function, if you'd like to ask a question, then I can unmute you. Okay, I think that's working. Right, we have, I'm going to open it up to Hugh. So Hugh, you're unmuted. Well, you should be unmuted. Yeah, you're unmuted.
Thank you. First, that was a really good speech. And second, I just wanted to pick up on something that you said about Starmer, because I'm really impressed by him. But I'm still worried, because I'm not sure if he marks a change in the tide of public debate, or if he's the exception that proves that we're on a downward slide. And I was wondering what you thought about that, bearing in mind our recent bag of politicians.
Well, I hope he might be wrong about that. I'm impressed by him too. He has been more emphatic, more decisive and clearer than I thought he would be. I think by and large, his appointments have been pretty good. And I think he's demonstrated a gravity that I wasn't certain he would show. So I've been impressed with him too. And I think he has a chance of doing something remarkable. I think he is a serious character. So I don't think he would represent a kind of downward spiral in that sense. I think the open question, though, is whether he can define a government which is worthy of our support. I think that remains to be seen. So whether he's got a notion of where he wants to go, or whether he's prepared to find one and be the front of it, I'm really not yet sure. So I think he's a big figure. I think there are question marks too about his team, because it's quite rare that anybody does it entirely by themselves, and you need a good team that we can put our trust in. And I'm not certain the Labour Party has an incredibly good collection of people yet. But I am impressed by him. I think he has got some of the characteristics of people who win general elections. People are already starting to see him as a viable prime minister, which is a pretty good effort for someone who's only been in the job a short period of time. He's generally quite calm and measured. And it'll be interesting to see how much he increases his fire against Boris Johnson. I think he's starting to. I was very pleased to see that his initial critique of the government was about competence. And this is a constant argument in the Labour Party. Labour people quite often want to criticise the Tories for being bad people. Their line of attack is usually essentially they're doing bad things on purpose out of ideological relish. And that's not really true for the most part. And even if it were true, it's a very, very bad criticism to make of when 40-odd% of the electorate has just voted Conservative. It's a really stupid thing to say, that you are all bad people. That's not a way of winning them back. Much better, don't go on motive, go on competence. So I know you're trying to do the right thing, you're just failing. And that's better. And that is where Starmer has been over the last few months. So I think that augurs well too. He's been quite gentle in a way, and he's starting to ratchet up the criticism now, and gradually I think that's a way to do it. So I'm impressed by him. I think he would be a huge, a massive upgrade on the last two Labour leaders, certainly. So I'm going to retain a sort of guarded optimism, although it doesn't come with it comes with a sort of warning that it may be disappointed. But at the moment, from the point of view of the Labour Party, he is at least competitive. He at least looks like someone who you no longer feel is a desperate candidate to be Prime Minister, and it's someone who is potentially viable.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that question and answer. And I will go now to Jamie, who has his hand up. If you should be unmuted.
Hello. I just wanted to start by saying thank you for doing this talk. It was quite enlightening, so thank you. I think my question is, in polls that were taken after the general election, there was an increase in sentiment amongst the pollsters that voters were increasingly becoming in favour of policies like nationalisation. And I remember that there was a poll by YouGov which stated that most voters agreed with the Labour Party on economic issues, although it doubted it had a kind of trust issue in terms of its economic issues. And then in terms of social concerns, there was a kind of view that actually the Conservatives were seen as like the more trustworthy or the better party. So my question is the debate over Labour's future maybe less about a kind of conflict between Clause 1 and Clause 4 of the Labour Constitution in terms of nationalisation of industries, and potentially maybe a debate over the cosmopolitanism of the Labour Party and potentially a move towards social conservatism? And thank you.
Yes, it may well be. I mean, I think that rests on whether the politics of cultural divide survive a recession or not. And now, as I said before, in any dispute, both things are always right. So they will survive to some extent, but it's whether the material politics becomes a very big factor again. The Labour Party in 2019 fought a standard conventional material politics campaign and got beaten in a culture war. And it may be that they were just one election too early, and that economic health and economic well-being is a very significant factor again in 2014. But I take seriously the divide that there is in social conservatism. That's definitely the case. And let's look forward a bit. You've got to always project forward to the electorate which is coming rather than the one which has just been. And broadly speaking, the division on socially conservative views is one of age. And the Conservative Party average voter is now 52 years of age. And below 52, Labour Party wins the general election, even under Corbyn. Above 52, the Conservative Party win very emphatically. And of course, more people over age 52 vote. So that's why they won. But that group is growing older. And, you don't need me to say that what the inevitable end of that kind of group. And the new generation, people of your age and younger coming through, are as a group much more liberal, much more cosmopolitan than their predecessors. And this is true of all social classes. It's not just a middle class phenomenon. So the assumption is that whilst you may change your economic position from the age of 21 to the age of 50, because social mobility does that, some people, and you earn money and you change your position, we tend not to change our social views in the same way. So if you are a relatively liberal person on things like race and position of women, etc., at the age of 22, it's overwhelmingly likely that you'll have the same views when you're 52. And so I suspect that those views will simply become the mainstream. And the Conservative Party, of course, has adapted to this already. You know, the Cameron Conservative Party really was a liberal cosmopolitan party in this respect, because none of that group of people were uncomfortable in the modern Britain. On the contrary, they looked very comfortable within it. And so I think that it's a declining constituency if you take the socially conservative position. I think it works now on Brexit as its sort of symbol, but I'd be astonished if it will still working in 10 years' time. I just think the numbers are all going in the opposite direction. So there's some aspects of social conservatism which I think are consensual, you know, family, being opposed to crime, all the things I said before, where Blair was really good and the Labour Party tends to struggle. I think Starmer will occupy that territory, and he already is starting to do so. But I don't think there's a future for the Labour Party electorally, quite apart from it being wrong in my view. I don't think there's a future for it in inhabiting a serious social conservatism. I think you leave that to the Tory party if it wants to go there, and I think it's a dwindling band of people. And I think in due course, they'll regret it.
Thank you. And I think we have one final question from Fergal. So I'll unmute you, and brilliant. That should be.
Hello. Thank you, and thank you for the talk. The question I had was about Starmer's position on Scotland. And I mean, Starmer's been notably reticent over Scottish independence and over, you know, for instance, Richard Leonard as the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. And it's axiomatic that he's keeping his options open vis-a-vis an SNP coalition. So how do you think Starmer will handle next year's Scottish election?
Yeah, very difficult, because there are lots of different objectives here. So I think there's, you know, it's true in the press and it's true in politics that some of the things that you want conflict with other things you want. So, for example, if you're an institution or a politician who is a unionist, and that's true of the Murdoch newspapers, and it's true of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, but your own personal interest, maybe your institutional interest, may be in breaking up the union, you've got a conflict on your hands. And anyone who is essentially a Conservative rather than a Labour supporter might think that there's a benefit to be had in a break of the union. And this has always been one of the paradoxes of the Conservative Party, is that it does have some doctrine, and it does have some consistent beliefs. And one of those beliefs has been the integrity of the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And even when, as it was for a long time, that was not in the interest of the Conservative Party because the Labour Party was so dominant in Scotland. Nevertheless, the Conservative Party, which retains the idea of unionist in its name, was a strongly unionist party. Now, they've not been acting as though that's the case recently, but again, more by accident than by design, I think, because they remain strongly committed to the union. But there will be an interesting question for some of the press, which way they go on that. They're almost always led by their readers, the press. So I think that's the thing to remember, is that don't suppose that this just the influence of a detached proprietor or editor. It's almost always the case that newspapers follow their readers rather than lead them. Why was the Times pro-Remain, but the Sun was pro-Brexit? Not because of the same proprietor and not because of the propensities of the editors either, but because the readership of the Times was 72% Remain, the leadership of the Sun was 72% the other way. So they have a good commercial reason to satisfy their readers. And that's at least as important as the readers doing what the newspaper says. So there'll be, to some extent, they will follow the politics of it. And the politics at the moment look as though they're heading, in a way no one seems to be able to stop, towards a majority for independence. And I strongly suspect that the response of this government will simply be to pretend that's not happening, to deny the prospect of a referendum, really on the grounds that it would be lost if the one were to be granted. Now, there's a great irony there, of course, that the very people who demanded a Brexit referendum for so long will be instrumental in denying a Scottish independence referendum. But there we are. That no one said you had to be consistent in politics. And I think they'll say that we've not yet had the generational shift that Nicola Sturgeon said had to happen before there was another one. And I'll just finish with the Labour Party's position on this, because it's really difficult. The Labour Party, as I said before, really needs to recover in Scotland in order to have a hope of winning a significant victory in Britain. But there's no real sign of that recovery at the moment. The SNP remain very high. They're very pleased that Ruth Davidson has retired, because she really did look as though she could turn the Tory party into a powerhouse in Scotland again. In the 1950s, the Tories were the biggest party in Scotland, so it's not inconceivable. And Ruth Davidson had the capacity to do it. But the Labour Party is not recovering there. And therefore, what that raises is the prospect at the next election of a potential coalition between Labour and the SNP at Westminster. Now, a reason I think that can't happen and won't happen is the Scottish Labour Party won't stand for it. And also, even if they did it, just think what would happen. You've got a majority only with the consent of the SNP. That obviously comes at the price of an independence referendum. If that independence referendum then happens and Scotland votes to leave the United Kingdom, not only have you broken up the United Kingdom, but you then lose your own coalition at Westminster. So it has an obsolescence built in. So I think the relations between the nations is going to be a very, very tricky thing. And I think our politics are quite fragmented. They're fragmented by region, as we've seen recently. They're fragmented by nation. And I don't think we've yet seen a political leader who's got the capacity to bring the nation fully together politically. And in my lifetime, the only two people who've managed this in very different ways were Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s and 1980s, who was able to win a very large majority, but then Scotland broke off from that. And then much later, Tony Blair, who won a huge victory across the country. And the rarity of that shows just how difficult it is to do. It shows both what a talented politician Boris Johnson is, in the sense that he got close to doing it, but also what an incredibly difficult inheritance he has, because Scotland is on a different trajectory from the rest of the United Kingdom. And for those of us who regard the union as more than the sum of its parts, that is a very difficult moment. And I think it's going to be very tricky for all the political parties and all the commentators of it into the future.
Thank you very much, Philip, for both a very scintillating talk, and also thank you for staying for that Q&A session as well. It's a very important discussion, because obviously, I mean, as we enter this new phase, we're now beginning to deconstruct, and hopefully that will come soon. The government's response to the coronavirus pandemic, as we begin to raise questions, Labour will be in prime position to challenge them, hold them to account. I'm interested to see how that's received more broadly. And I would say before we close, please do read, if you haven't read already, Left Out, which is the book just being written about essentially the inside story of the Corbyn disaster. And Philip's written a review in the Sunday Times, I believe 2 weeks ago. It was in the Culture magazine 2 weeks ago.
That's right.
I would read that review. It's an excellent review. So read that and then read the Left Out book as well. But I think it's Gabriel Pogrund and I forget the other.
It's Patrick Maguire is the other one.
So please do read that. It's an excellent insight as well into to kind of follow up on working out where it all went so disastrously wrong. And it doesn't reflect well on the Seamus Milnes and the insiders as well. So with that, I want to say thank you very, very much to Philip for doing this. I'm aware he's probably done many of these before. And so you can get a bit of Zoom fatigue. So thank you very much to Philip.
You're welcome.
CLIO is running a panel of a series of events this year. We've got some very exciting historians come out, including the Dean of Cold War Historians, John Lewis Gaddis, as well, which is coming up in November. So thank you very, very, very much to Philip Collins. And brilliant. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.